If you've been stuck at the intermediate stage for some time now and you're wondering why the needle isn't moving for you, why you're not getting to the advanced stage despite practicing all the time, this video is for you. Here are the top 3 reasons why guitarists stay stuck in the intermediate stage and don't progress to the advanced stage. I'm Christian with Axfire, and I specialize in helping guitarists break through to their highest potential. Let's go. First thing I want to address here is that the things that you've been practicing to get to the intermediate stage, the methods you've been using to practice that have gotten you this far, will not be the same methods of practicing and understanding and viewing the instrument that will get you from where you are now to where you want to be in the advanced stage. Let's look at something like scales, for example. When you're a beginner, you learn, okay, I have to practice this scale in order to play a solo, or I need to practice the scale because it's good for my technique. You know, we think about scales in that kind of way. As an intermediate guitar player that wants to be advanced, you have to start thinking about how that scale relates to the chords that are being played underneath, and not just seeing the scale as simply a collection of notes that sounds good together or that is proper. Here's an example. Let's take the key of C major, nice and easy. We're going to play and map out a C major scale in the 5th position. If you're a cage system person, this is C major pattern 3. Okay, there it is. So as a beginner, you learn the scale shape, you practice the scale shape up and down, you try to see how fast you can do it. Maybe you're aware that you can move that shape around and play it in different keys, or that solos are built around that scale in some way. The intermediate guitar player that is advancing needs to start to see that scale as a collection of intervals that relates to the chords that you're playing underneath, so that you understand how the notes that you choose for your melodies in your improvisation, or if you're writing a solo, you understand how those notes relate to the chords underneath, and you understand the context of it. For example, if I play a simple progression in the key of C major, let's say 1, 5, 6, 4, that would be C major, G major, A minor, and F. I have to be aware of what those notes are as I'm soloing. So here's an action step. When you're practicing the C major scale, don't just practice the scale up and down. Practice the arpeggios that you can build out from the scale. Okay, so if you're practicing the C major scale, first step is, I think, to map out the scale shape itself, so practicing it up and down. But then the second step is to go through each one of those chords and locate those notes inside of the scale shape. That's what an arpeggio is, playing chord tones separately. So starting with C major, the notes that make up the C chord are C, E, G. And so what I'll do is I'll find all the C, E, and G notes inside of my scale shape. Like that. What that does for me is it instantly gives me a map of where all the best sounding notes are to land on when I'm playing over the C chord. Okay, so if I'm playing a melody like this, I know that ending on the C note is going to sound great. Or if I want to end on a different note that sounds good as well, I could end on the E. Like that. We know this melody is going to work over the C chord because it ends on a C note or an E note or a G note. There's the C, there's the E, or a G. And that's all going to sound great over the C chord. But now, what if I switch to the G chord? How can I approach that? Well, I would want to make sure that I adapt my melody now to resolve to notes of the G chord, which are G, B, and D. First step is to map out those notes inside of our scale shape, like this. So those notes become my new target points. I want to play a melody that sounds coherent, that goes well with the first melody that I played, but I can't end on a C or an E because those notes don't fit with the G chord, right? We're working with the notes G, B, D. So now I have to target one of those notes at the end of my melody. I can play a similar melody, but adapt it to the notes of the G chord, like this. Okay, that note that I finished on was the note D. So if I played the first melody over the C chord, now the second part of the melody over the G chord, it's going to sound a lot better. And I only know that because I've mapped out where the chord tones are inside of my scale. Next thing you want to do is map out the chord tones for the remaining chords in your chord progression. A minor looks like this. And F looks like this. All of those notes are available to me inside of my scale shape. And I just want to drive this point home again, that we're not practicing the scale as just a linear series of notes anymore. Now we're viewing it as a palette of really, really appropriate notes for each chord in our chord progression. Now, if you do this right, you should be able to play a melody completely unaccompanied, no backing track, etc., just you, and have the listener be able to detect that there is a chord progression happening underneath what you're playing as a soloist. The last thing that you want is to play a series of notes that just goes up and down and doesn't really sound like much to the listener, right? You want it to sound like music, and having a clear chord progression is the best way to make your playing sound musical. So I'm going to try a short example. I'm just going to play a quick little unaccompanied solo in the key of C major that follows that same chord progression that I laid out before. 1, 5, 6, and 4. Okay, here we go. Okay, something like that. Hopefully you could hear the chord progression that was happening underneath my melody because I was targeting those notes specifically at the beginning of every new bar. If you want to go from sounding like an intermediate who's just running his scales up and down, and granted, you might be pretty good at that, but it doesn't translate to the listener as music. To get to that advanced stage, you're going to have to start thinking about your scales in this way. Second reason why you still sound like an intermediate guitarist is because you're still practicing the same things in the same way without any kind of variation or expansion. Let's say you're practicing a B minor arpeggio. Most rock and metal guys would play it something like that, or a 2-string. As an intermediate guitar player, you can be expected to play stuff like that. As an advanced player, you're not going to be playing those basic triadic sounds, at least not all the time. You're going to be leaning more towards things like 7th harmony, adding extensions on top of your chords like 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths, this kind of thing. So an advanced player is always looking for ways to take an arpeggio, for example, and add cool sounding notes to it to make it different sounding than just your stock arpeggio that goes up and down like that. Instead of playing that B minor arpeggio like this, we can add a 7th to it, the flat 7, turning it into B minor 7. Now what if we take that into a 2nd octave? And we combine the two. That sounds a lot cooler and more interesting for the listener to hear than just simply playing a triad arpeggio up or down. We've heard that, okay? We've spent the last 40, 45 years, something like that, being painfully aware that sweep arpeggios exist, and we've heard those triadic arpeggios to death. So why don't we now take it upon ourselves to add new colorful notes to the arpeggios that we already know and turn them into new interesting things that excite us and the listener. Here's another way you could approach that. Take the minor triad shape and just simply add a random scale note to that. So I'm not talking about just any old note, but it has to be a note that belongs to the scale. Check this out. I took the minor arpeggio and added the G note on top. Relative to B minor, that's called a flat 6 interval. So you would analyze that as B minor, add flat 6, or simply you could look at that set of notes as G major 7. Now it sounds so much cooler. And you don't have to be super aware of the analysis of it. I mean, we're still thinking of it as a B minor tonality, just with color tones added. So that's one example. You could also add the 2nd note of the scale, which would be the note C sharp, for a nice moody texture on that B minor arpeggio. That's pretty cool too. There are so many expansive sounds that you can access by simply adding a neighboring scale tone to your existing arpeggio. And they're all over the place. Imagine that you did that with all the 7 arpeggios that you can find in your key. And in any one of those situations, you have no less than 3 other cool extensions that you can add to that arpeggio. The palette is huge. Okay, now it's up to you to go exploring. Now that we've discussed all that, let's put this idea together into a quick example. Something like this. I'm going to take a B minor to a D major arpeggio chord progression. And I'm going to add some neighboring scale tones to those arpeggios and see what we get. So much cooler than simply blasting a 3-string arpeggio up and down. The last point I want to bring up here in this video for why intermediates still sound like intermediates is reason number 3, not focusing enough on specific technical development. Guitar players have a tendency to view their performance, their technical execution, as a very binary black and white thing. I can do it or I can't do it. I can play this song, I can play as fast as this guy, or I can't. We don't really think about what goes into the development of that technique. Let's take alternate picking for example. You could look at somebody like John Petrucci who can maintain strict 16th notes at 200 BPM for a couple minutes and not miss a note. We can look at someone like that and then look at ourselves and ask ourselves, I can barely hang on 16th notes at 120 BPM for a few seconds, let alone doing it for a couple minutes at 200 like John Petrucci. The thing that separates the John Petruccis from the rest of us is that he has worked specifically on his speed and on his stamina. The thing I want to make you aware of is that there are different aspects of your technique that need to be trained. If you work on your speed, you have to know that your stamina is not going to rise with it at the same time. You work on speed and endurance separately. Don't confuse that. People get disheartened by learning a solo, practicing it slow, and then inching the metronome up 1 BPM, 2 BPM up at a time over a period of days, weeks, months, and then get frustrated why they get stuck halfway along the way to their goal tempo. The reason for that is because you're training it wrong. You have to work on the speed first and then add the endurance component after that. So how do you work on your speed specifically? What I always tell people to do is to break things up into small chunks and work on it in small bursts. So if I'm practicing a scale passage on the top 2 strings, for example, I'm not going to work on doing the entire thing all connected at once, but rather I'm going to break it up into small bite-sized chunks and work on the speed specifically before I even think about introducing the stamina component. Your speed practice might look something like this, where you have 1 or 2 beats of a passage, and then you have some rest to allow yourself to reset, recalibrate, and gather your resources for the next rep. If you were to take a peek into my practice room to see what I do to work on speed and what I coach my clients on, you would often see something that looks like this. Not connected, small bursts of things. When you hit your goal tempo, then you add reps after that. So if you can do 1 rep at your goal tempo, say it's 180 16th notes, then you work on doing 2 reps at 180 16th notes, and on and on. That's the speed burst approach. You can also practice the connected line at a much lower tempo, but do it for time. That's practicing for endurance specifically. The more you separate your practice into these 2 domains, the sooner the 2 of them are going to meet in the middle, and you're going to be able to sustain a fast passage for much longer. Don't treat it as practicing or playing. Start thinking of it as training. That's what the advanced players do. So there you have it. We discussed the 3 biggest reasons that I see as a guitar coach why intermediate guitar players stay stuck in the intermediate stage and don't make progress to the advanced stage. What I see time and time again is that once players start focusing all their energy on these 3 main areas, they see progress so much faster than they've ever experienced before. And it's kind of an amazing thing. You look at what you're doing and think, wow, am I really playing that? Am I really thinking of the fretboard in this way? Am I really executing my ideas this way? That's what you want. You want to practice and train in a way that gets the kind of results that have you surprise yourself. This is how you do it. So those 3 main areas, to sum up: 1, thinking of scales as menus for chord tones. 2, taking the information that you already practice, like a triad arpeggio, for example, and looking for ways to expand upon it to create a 7th chord or extended harmony, that kind of thing. And 3, getting really, really specific about the actual physical skill that you're trying to develop and knowing what that is and how to practice for it. So if you're practicing for top speed, practicing in a very specific way with very specific parameters that lend itself to that thing. Or if you're working on endurance, taking a whole different approach that is conducive to developing endurance. So there you go. Take that advice or don't. But either way, if you do those 3 things, I promise you are going to see way better results than you ever have in your life. Be consistent, be excited, and make progress. I'm Christian with Axfire, and I'll see you next time.